I'm sure there will be a few more coming as we move along. So it's an honor to introduce Shaun, who is colleague of sociology, but not in the sociology department, but in the Department of Education at the University of Manchester. And we've been in contact on and off for the last 2 years or so almost, because he's writing a book for Ashgate, a series on public intellectuals and the sociology of knowledge. And Shaun will have his manuscript from Bauman published hopefully in the spring. And part of that ongoing work he will present to us today. So, Shaun. So usually the way it works for those who are new here, 40-45 minutes talk plus then open discussion. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you to Andreas. Very nice introduction, which I think probably even Bono would have shied away from. But anyway, yes, this is me, Shaun, and I work at the University of Manchester, and I don't, like I said, I don't particularly like my name, which is probably why I've never really made it as an academic, because it's too sort of one-syllable-ish, a bit like sort of shut up or don't shit or something like that. But anyway, what I want to do today is I want to talk about Zygmunt Bauman, and as you no doubt know, Zygmunt Bauman, well into his 80s now, he's written some 50 books. His career starts, his writing career starts in the late 50s, early 60s, where he writes about actually existing socialism in Poland. In 1971, he finds himself at the University of Leeds, where he's writing about socialism as an active utopia, how it can solve problems for the West. He has a postmodern turn in the 1990s, has a liquid turn in the year 2000, very long successful career. Now obviously I can't talk about all of those things, but for me, I think I've never really particularly liked Bauman's work. I've never been particularly impressed by it. Our paths did cross when I was a postgraduate student at the University of Leeds. We had a fallout about Durkheim, we had a fallout about assessment. He did the unthinkable thing of saying that one of my essays wasn't any good, which I was obviously deeply upset about. So you can see I'm very petty and drag on things for over many decades. Having said that, there was one book which really did stand out, and it was the book which he published in 1989 called Modernity in the Holocaust. So I'll rubbish all the other books, but I sort of left this one aside, thinking this is very special because the argument in there is coherent. It's something which I feel attached to in some way, shape or form. Right, what's Bauman saying then? Well, basically what he's saying is that the Holocaust could have happened in any modern society at any time. It's not peculiarly 20th century, it's not peculiarly German. Okay, it could have happened anywhere at any time. Now, why is this? Well, he says because what happens, and he draws upon the work of Immanuel Levinas at this point, he says that it's very difficult for one individual to kill another individual. Okay, it's very difficult to do that. And the reason for this is because when an individual looks at another individual, what they do is this. They know that God made the person in his own image. So when you look at the other person, you are looking at God. And you also know that you are also, in part, looking at yourself. And this acts as a barrier, preventing the person from killing another individual. Now, it's different in modernity. Okay, it's different in modernity. Because the thing about modernity is that modernity likes order. Okay, it's very, very ordered. And in that book, Modernity in the Holocaust, what Bauman does is he launches for the first time the idea of the gardening state. Okay, the idea of the gardening state. The idea that the state acts like a gardener. So whereas the gardener keeps order in the garden, okay, maintains the borders, looks for weeds, pulls out the weeds, even though a weed in itself, there's nothing wrong with it, it can be a thing of great beauty. But if it's in the wrong place, if it's an uninvited guest, then it has to be removed. Now in modernity what happens is that people often play the role of weeds. Okay? So the gardening state looks at the society, it identifies individuals who are a potential threat to modernity. If it can, it will assimilate them. If not, it may exclude them. And in the case of the Nazis, what will happen, it will go beyond exclusion and will destroy them. Okay? It will destroy them. Because part of the mess that modernity inherited was the Christian idea, the pre-modern idea of the Jew. Okay? Okay? The Jew has been the person who was looked on with suspicion because they were never wholly part of the state. Okay, so when we come across modernity, what we find is that we've got this conception of the Jew that's pre-modern, and this is the thing, this is the group of people, above all others, although there are others, of course, on grounds of sexuality, so the Nazis were people who were willing to target gay men, and of course travellers as well. Okay. So, modernity dislikes mess, imposes the idea of the guardian state in order to keep order. Okay. Now, how does it do this? How do we do this when we have this problem of looking at the other in the eyes as we looking at the eyes of God or looking at ourselves? Well, what Bauman argues is that bureaucratic rationality comes into play at this point, because what happens is that genocide takes place through bureaucratic means. So what happens is that the perpetrator makes the decision, and then there are a series of intermediaries between the perpetrator and the victim. So there's often a great distance, but there's often a number of intermediaries. So what you find is that Bauman talks about people like, for instance, Adolf Eichmann, where he'll say that Eichmann is a nice person if you met him individually, and he regards himself as being a person who merely organises an efficient train service. Okay? In my case, for instance, I couldn't kill another person, but I wouldn't have any moral objection to, say, digging coal. Okay? I could dig coal, like a job like digging coal, it's hard work. But I could dig coal, I could drive the coal from the pit to the railway station, I could be a fireman on the train. Okay? I could drive the train, but I quite like driving the train. But all of these things, all of this division of labour is necessary in order to bring about the Holocaust. So what we've got is we've got individual people within this very bureaucratic division of labour, each carrying out an action which in itself raises no serious moral concerns for the individual, but which when taken together produces genocide. Okay? So the only real person who has a moral hurdle to overcome is the individual who pours the cyanide tablets in the hole in the ceiling to gas the people inside. That's the only person who has the real problem. So what Bauman argues is that within a bureaucracy, what happens is that people develop what he calls an agentic state, okay, an agentic state, and that their behaviour becomes idiophoric. What he means by this is that people start to judge their actions, not in terms of the moral consequences of their actions, but in terms of their technical efficiency. Okay? So Eichmann, his job is to move people around from Germany and the occupied territories into Poland. If he does that efficiently, he's doing his job. He's merely acting under orders. Now, Bauman also goes on to say that sociologists have largely ignored the Holocaust. They've largely ignored it. And when they do look at the Holocaust, they don't look at it as the natural product of modernity. They view it as being modernity going wrong in some way. It was a dreadful accident of history. He also, as I've already suggested, he says that the Holocaust can be looked at as an ideal example, a textbook example indeed, of Tayloristic scientific management. Okay? Now, I think the thesis is wrong on both counts. Like, I was quite shocked going back and rereading modernity in the Holocaust, because when I first read it I was impressed by it. When I read it the second time I was much less impressed by it. Right, well, have sociologists ignored the Holocaust? Well, they haven't. Okay, they haven't, because from 1940 through to 1945-46, Talcott Parsons, for instance, wrote 15 papers about National Socialism, and one in particular, produced a list of all the books that I think I'll probably mention with all the authors, so you can have a look at that. You can tell that once upon a time I taught general studies. If you want to take one of those, and pass them on to your friends. Okay, so wrong on both counts. Talcott Parsons, what did he do? Writes these 15 papers about various aspects of National Socialism, very keen on that. And I'm not just talking about papers that are difficult to get hold of or whatever, but even in his big book, The Social System, I was quite surprised at how much space Talcott Parsons spends differentiating between American modernity and modernity in Nazi Germany, and the differences between the two. And he does rightly point out, he says that Marxists have a tendency to view modernity as the same everywhere, and it isn't. There are significant differences between modernity in different times and at different places. In 1942, it's on your list, in 1942, Parsons wrote a paper, as you can see, about anti-Semitism. Now, that paper came as a surprise when I read it, because it was in that particular paper that Parsons, for the very first time, launches the idea of the pattern variable, okay, where he's talking about the difference between achievement and description. And he's talking about Jewish people in Nazi Germany. And of course, the pattern variable is within the very DNA of Parsonian structural functionalism. No, it is in there. It underpins the big book, the social system. Okay, so I think he's wrong to say sociologists ignore the Holocaust. They haven't. Okay, it's in there. It's in Parsons' work. The other issue that I would challenge Bauman on is the idea that the killing that took place during the Holocaust was bureaucratic in nature. There are various people, Snyder in 2010 stands out, who argues that about half of the people who perished in the Holocaust died outside of gas chambers and concentration camps, okay? And you can point to things like Christopher Browning's book, Ordinary Men, which is about Special Police Battalion 101. It's a dark read, I have to say. When you read this thing, I personally could not believe the inhumanity that was in it. And I knew I was going to read about people being killed. I knew that before I even opened the book. What I didn't expect was to read about the level of cruelty and also the photographs that he produces, where you get young men, middle-aged men, from 40 years or whatever, but they're stood with the Jewish people in front of them, and they're holding whips in their hands, and they're engaging in things like beard burning. Okay, now they're doing this out of cruelty. Okay, they're doing this out of cruelty, and sadly I forgot to put it on here. But there's a little book published by Gad Beck, and you can tell what the book's about from the title. The book is called A Gay Jew Living in Wartime Berlin, and it's not a happy story, is what I can say. I mean, the way in which not just Jewish people were hunted down, but gay men who were Jewish as well, and the way in which they were treated with a level of cruelty which is just unbelievable to read. This is not bureaucratic. It's not at a distance. It is, in Levinas's terms, it's in close proximity, face-to-face, visage, and yet the cruelty takes place. And half of the victims of the Holocaust lost their lives in this fashion. Also struck me when I read modernity in the Holocaust the second time was what I think is a pretty obvious question, which I'm surprised nobody's asked before, and that is that if the Holocaust was a product of modernity, not a product of decision-making by people high in the Nazi Party, but a product of modernity, then come May 1945, when the camps have been liberated, okay, many of the victims are out on long marches, many died from starvation and just exhaustion. Why didn't the Allies just simply turn the long marches round, march people back into the concentration camps and continue the modernity project? They didn't, because they had no political will to do so. So I think Bauman is wrong in terms of sociology ignoring the Holocaust. He's wrong in terms of looking at the Holocaust in purely factory farming, in bureaucratic farming, there's much more cruelty involved. Now this theme in Bauman's work, first launched in Modernity and the Holocaust, about why good people do bad things, Bauman has returned to this in his 2011-2012 writings. Okay, so if you look at things like This Is Not a Diary, or Collateral Damage, or particularly the contribution that he's made to the Histories of Violence project. So if you look him up on the website, you'll see him. He's returned to this theme, but to his credit, what he's done is he started to investigate face-to-face killing. Okay, investigate face-to-face killing. He talks about Eichmann, he talks about the Holocaust, he talks about these at great length. He talks about Christopher Browning and some of the other authors as well that have written similar pieces. But he also talks about this person, Slovenka Draculic. And in 2004, she published a book called They Would Not Hurt to Fly. Okay? They Would Not Hurt to Fly. And I read and watched Bauman give his account of this book, and I thought this is going to be another awful read, which it was. What she does is, she's a journalist, and she went to The Hague to observe the tribunal at work, and she gives a very detailed account, which Bauman reproduces, of people like Radomir Kovac, who you may have heard of, currently serving a 40-year prison sentence for his involvement with what became known as the Fokkia genocide. And two other of his colleagues as well. She talks about what they did. And what they did was absolutely dreadful. They were involved in murder, they were involved in brutalising the population, they were involved in mass rape of women. It was a truly awful thing. What Bauman does is he says he wants to move away from what sociologists and others call the monster hypothesis, the idea that it's monsters who do these dreadful things. Okay, so not, instead of looking at Radomir Kovac or Goran Jelic, who we'll talk about shortly, as monsters, what we should see them is as victims of circumstance. Okay, victims of circumstance. What Bauman argues is that, and he takes this from Draculic and indeed from Philip Zimbardo, who we'll talk about shortly. He says that there are situational forces at work which push good people to do bad things. Okay? Push bad people to do bad things. This person, Goran Jelic, she talks about it at great length. Bauman also talks about it at great length. He was involved in the massacre at Luka camp. 23 years old, never been in trouble with the police. He was an ordinary person, just like Radomir Kovac. Radomir Kovac and the three people he stood trial with, one was a waiter, one was a shop assistant, one was a driver. Okay? Goran Jelic in 1993 becomes a police officer. And for 18 days, he went on a killing spree at this particular camp. And Bauman describes it, Draculic describes it in terms of he killed an old man for dropping a bottle on the floor. He killed a young man because this young man had married a Serbian girl, killed him because of it. He invited his girlfriend, Monica, to observe the killing that took place. And this was all killing face to face with handguns or with sticks, etc. But he was an ordinary person, and in her account, which Bauman rejects, what Draculic says is that he was a victim of situational circumstances. He was a victim of nationalism. Okay, it was Jelic and the others. They were victims, not just perpetrators, but they were victims as well. They were victims of nationalism. Okay? Because unlike in Poland, when the communist regime collapsed, what happened was that the likes of Slobodan Milosevic, who was the communist president of Serbia, just reinvented himself as a nationalist, okay, and spread this nationalism throughout the country. Unlike in Poland, there was no solidarity, there was no democratic alternative that could fill the gap. So nationalism was allowed to run riot, and these people did these awful things. They changed from ordinary men who you could, I mean, in this case, for instance, both Bauman and Drake described him as being a person who enjoyed fishing. Okay, he enjoyed fishing, and this is what Bauman says about him. He enjoys fishing, that he, these are his phrases now, not mine, I wouldn't use this phrase. He would give up his seat on a tram for an invalid. He would return a lost wallet to its rightful owner. Okay? And there were lots of people at his tribe who said, yes, this is a person who never had a bad word to say for anybody. But in these 18 days, he went on a killing spree and nobody could believe it. Now, Bauman says that there isn't sufficient depth in her explanation for why these ordinary men did what they did. If you want more depth, then you have to turn, says Bauman, you have to turn to Philip Zimbardo. And in particular, what you've got to turn to is the 2007 book, The Lucifer Effect. Now, the Lucifer Effect, if you're not familiar with it, is a very big book. It takes you through the Stanford prison experiments in the early 1970s, okay, which if you're of an age like me, you'll remember and appreciate. But what happened was that this book came about because Gary Myers, who was the attorney defending Chip Fredericks, who was one of the people who was accused of the brutalisation and torture of Iraqi detainees in Abu Ghraib. He was approached by Gary Myers and asked if he would act as an expert witness. So what Zimbardo did was he regarded this as an opportunity to revisit the argument from the Stanford prison experiment in Abu Ghraib. So he interviews in great detail Chip Fredericks and tries to get an account of his story. Now, I have to say, it's the same argument, okay? Chip Fredericks, Lindy England, these were ordinary people, and yet, when they were put in these extraordinary circumstances, they did awful things. So it's not a case of, this is Zimbardo's words, it's not a case of one bad apple, it's a case of a bad barrel. Okay, that's what he's saying. So, ordinary people put in different circumstances did awful things. When they're far away, when they're out of sight, they do these awful things. Now, although I do like Zimbardo's work, I am very conscious of the fact that he's very popular, and there are times when he's quite populist. Okay? I don't like the idea of the celebrity academic. Okay? It might partly be to do with jealousy, I understand. But you know when you're sitting in your car and you're listening to the news and there's some academic on giving their view, you're bound to think, well, why didn't they ring me? I work in Manchester, outside of Media City. The BBC never contact me. So, could I have your views? So, okay, partly it's jealous, I understand. But anyway, partly it's because when you read Zimbardo's work, you know full well, at some point, you're going to come across a sound bite, and you think, yes, that's for the Sunday Times. That's what's going to be in the article. And I read it, it's a huge book, and you get to page 500 and something or whatever, and yes, it is really bad. There's people stood on cardboard boxes with electrodes attached to them, made to feel if they fall off, they'll be electrocuted, there's beatings taking place, threatening people with dogs, it's absolutely awful. And I thought, well, the popular bit's going to come soon, it's the populist bit's going to come soon. And there it is, on about page 530, 540, wherever, he starts to talk about, this is his phrase, the torture chicks. And I thought, oh yeah, the torture chicks, this is the populist bit. We'll read it anyway. Now, of all this dark stuff that I've read, and all of it is shocking, I have to say, the stuff about the tortured chicks was quite shocking indeed. It's an account of a whistleblower called Eric Starr, who was a translator. Okay? So he would sit in on interrogations and translate for the American interrogators. And he talks about the actions and the activities of a group of female interrogators. And Zimbardo talks about one example in great detail, which is the case of Brooke. Okay, Brooke. Now, the Americans had a detainee who they arrested in Arizona shortly after 9/11. And this person was very, very difficult to break under interrogation. He spent most of his time alone, not with the other prisoners. He spent most of his time alone in his cell praying. Okay? And Brooke told Starr that her intention was to break the relationship between the detainee and God in order to make him more amenable to giving information. And Starr talks in some detail, and Zimbardo reports it, and Bauman uses it in his account. And this is what she says. She says, Brooke turns up in front of this interrogator. I'll have a drink, because it's a bit scary. Brooke turns up into the room. 21-year-old detainee. And she walks round him. She walks round him. And she asks if he finds her attractive. To which she doesn't answer. So what she does is, she stands in front of him and she unbuttons her uniform. And underneath, she has a very tight, very revealing army t-shirt. And she asks the detainee what he thinks of her body and if he's aroused by it. And she stands behind him and she rubs her breasts against the back of his neck, at which point the detainee becomes very, very agitated and spits at her. Okay? And she walks in front of him there and she says, "You may not know this, but I'm having a period at the moment." And she starts to walk around him as she unbuttons her trousers, puts her hand into her panties, pulls out her hand with what the detainee thinks is menstrual blood, smears it on his face, okay, and then says, "You can go back to your cell, there's no water, and you can explain yourself to God, and we'll speak again tomorrow," as she leaves the room, okay? And this was the incident where Starr becomes the whistleblower and says, "Look, this cannot go on. This is not a way in which a democracy should treat its detainees." Bauman's account is, these people, Chick Fredericks, Lindy England, Brooke, these people are victims of circumstances. They are placed in a situation where there are situational constraints placed upon them. They are behaving in this agentic state. They are subject to the, what's the phrase that Bauman uses, the adiophoric state, whereby they're viewing detainees' information as being something that has to be achieved by any means possible. Okay. So Bauman uses these things to say, look, we live in a world where good people do evil things. Okay. Interestingly enough, when Philip Zimbardo interviews Lindy England, okay, it was prosecuted for what she did. One of the famous pictures of Lindy England is where there is a pile of Iraqi detainees piled up on top of each other, and she's laid across them with a smile on her face. Okay, they've had a photograph taken. And Zimbardo asks her, "Why did you do this thing? Why did you do these dreadful things to these other human beings?" And her explanation is, this was fun and games. This was fun and games. In other words, they were just having a laugh with the detainees. Okay, make them stand on a cardboard box, cover their heads up, strip them naked, make them think they're going to be attacked by dogs. It was fun. It was fun and funny. That's why they took photographs and shared them with each other, to have a laugh about it. What Bauman argues is that atrocities, very often, they become self-reproducing. Okay, they become self. Now the point is, Bauman's commentators, they have a tendency not to question, not to reread the sources that Bauman uses. Okay? Now, the reason why I've gone into such detail, really, about Zimbardo and Draculic is that their accounts are very good, but in the last analysis, both of them come to the same conclusion. And the same conclusion is that situational forces, important though they may be, do not excuse people's behaviours. What happens is that both Zimbardo and Draculic, what they argue is that the individual person remains a human agent with choices. Their behaviour is not determined. It couldn't be clearer what both of them have to say. But Bauman chooses not to record that. Okay, not to record that. He looks at the situational forces and says, yes, people do bad things because of the situations in which they find themselves in. In collateral damage, there's another element, which again is in modernity and the Holocaust, which is technological determinism. Technological determinism. He looks at, it's a very odd discussion, I have to say, in collateral damage, where he's talking about Hiroshima versus Auschwitz, which I just thought was an odd discussion to have, really. And he's saying that the Allies did dreadful things. Okay, they dropped these atomic bombs on the Japanese when they knew full well that the war in Europe had come to an end and the war in Japan was about to come to an end. But they dropped these bombs because they'd spent $2 billion developing them and they had to use them. It's a form of technological determinism. Well, it's not quite as simple as that, because there was a lot of argument took place about whether the bombs should be dropped, and there was President Truman rejected the advice of the team who produced the bomb to show restraint. It's well recorded, but also got to take into account the actions of the air crew as well, because Hiroshima was the first primary target that the American team had in place. But Nagasaki, 3 days later, was not a target. It wasn't on the approved list of targets, it wasn't on the list of secondary targets. What happened was that the air crew took off and flew over the Japanese mainland. They got to the primary target, which was Kyoto, and it was cloudy, but they primed the bomb. They didn't want to take it back. The thought of an aircraft carrier sat there with a plane returning with a primed nuclear weapon on board was not what the sailors wanted to see. Okay? So what they did was they circled round. They had 30 minutes of fuel left, and they went over the city of Nagasaki. It wasn't the ideal target because it's in a valley. It's a very steep valley, so the rock face on one side, and there was a fear that if they dropped the bomb there, that the blast would ricochet off the rock face and destroy the plane. Okay, so it wasn't ideal, but they had to drop the bomb in order to return because they didn't want to return with it. So, the idea of technological determinism, and he draws upon somebody called W.G. Seabolt at this point. And Seabolt was in 2007 wrote a book about the Allied bombing in Germany in 1942 to 45. Again, the idea that the British had invested in all these incendiary devices and that they needed to be used, the war was coming to an end, and Bauman says that the British had run out of targets, so they start to aim at targets that have no military value whatsoever. But again, Seabolt makes it absolutely crystal clear that this is not technological determinism. This is a political choice that Bomber Harris had to negotiate, not just with Churchill, but with the other coalition partners about the use of scarce resources, in this case a bombing mission for targets that weren't of any military value, on the grounds that they were destroying enemy morale. So it was a choice that was made. So again, Seabolt puts human agency right at the very centre of his analysis. In these 2012 2011 writings, Bauman does something for the first time which he hadn't done in any of the other 50 books that came before it. He puts himself in the analysis for the very first time. So if you have a look at the video, his contribution to the Histories of Violence project, he's talking about these people, Chip Fredericks, Abu Ghraib, and the rest. And he says, and what about me? He says, I could, by fate, by chance, by circumstance, find myself as being one of their victims. He also says, could I not also be the perpetrator? And what he seems to be saying is that this is in all of us. And very, very briefly, just very, very briefly, but to really watch it to capture it, he talks about Steiner and Steiner's concept of a malignant demon within us, which when we are in certain circumstances, such as a faraway prison, out of public view, when we feel that there will be little or no repercussion from our actions, the malignant demon takes over and we engage in evil. Okay, that's the only time he's ever mentioned it. Now, why does he want to undermine the monster hypothesis, undermine the idea that evil comes from evil people? Because he does argue that modern societies are quite good at dealing with monsters. Okay, they are quite good at dealing with monsters. You know, if we see a monster, we usually catch them and deal with them appropriately. What we find it difficult to deal with are evil that comes about through the normal behaviour of ordinary people. That's what we find difficult to control. But why does he want to do it? Well, I'm taking a bit of a leap at this point, but I think that the reason why Bauman has taken such an interest in this question is because he was caught up in what's known as the lustration process. Now, when communism came to an end in Poland, there was a negotiated settlement between Solidarity and General Jaruzelski. And basically, what happened was that the communists reinvented themselves and maintained public office. Okay, that's what happened. Now, many Poles were deeply upset by this. So the lustration process was about identifying people who had been communists, who worked for the security services, or who had collaborated with the security services. Okay? And these people should be stripped of public office. So you weren't allowed to stand for public office. That's in 2000. When we get to 2005, 2006, and then 2007, what happens is that the lustration process starts to take into account other people who work in public service. So when you get to 2007, it includes academics. Okay, it includes academics. So in 2007, it is revealed in great detail that from 1945 to 1953, that Bauman had been employed by the secret police in Poland. Okay? Now, you've got to remember what Bauman says in Modernity and the Holocaust, because Bauman does not like to talk about his past at all. He doesn't talk about his past life, where he did, where he went, whatever. Okay? But for Modernity and the Holocaust, we know about this agentic state. Okay? We know that when people work within a bureaucracy and they carry out actions which in themselves raise no moral problems, that they are still responsible, they are still culpable for the outcome of what the organisation did. Okay? So although we don't know what Bauman did personally, he says in an article, in an interview in The Guardian in 2007, that he was involved in propaganda. He was involved in propaganda, and that his interest was in preventing terrorism in Poland, which he says is a good thing. Although I have to say, the people who were labelled as terrorists were the Home Army, the armed resistance to the German occupation. Okay, after the war, these people, the Home Army, because they didn't fight with the Red Army, they were regarded as being at least suspicious, and the Stalinist forces asked them to give up their arms and refused to do so, so they were treated as terrorists. But what the role of the Secret Service was from 1945 through to 1953 was to help impose Stalinism in Poland. And it was by the most violent of means, the movement of population, for instance, okay, because what Stalin wanted was that he wanted an ethnically pure Poland. Okay? So people who were not Polish, Germans, for instance, were pushed out of the country. Belarusians pushed out of the country. There were also populations that didn't have a homeland, who couldn't be pushed out of the country. Okay? Those people, remembering the Holocaust, were assimilated. So there was a process of Polonization taking place, where people would be forced into learning language and culture, Polish language and Polish culture. The Secret Service was also involved in silencing the opposition. So there was a referendum which was rigged, 2 elections which were rigged, arbitrary arrest, internment, prison without trial. It was a very dreadful time in Poland. And of course, none of us knew this. Okay, when I was a student at the University of Leeds, I heard some gossip that that Bauman had been in the KGB. Some brave soul in a seminar asked him, which he wasn't very pleased about. He said no, which was the right answer, of course. But he's in this position whereby his past has been revealed. And 1953, he didn't resign his post in 1953. He didn't say, oh, this is dreadful, I've been acting like a monster, I'm not a monster, I'm a nice person. He was asked to leave his post, okay? There was an anti-Semitic purge of the party in 1953. There was a consequence of the Stalinist doctor's plot some years previously. So he's in this position whereby people are starting to question his past as an individual person. And I think that Bauman perceives in himself this moral failing. So when he looks at the likes of Lindy Ingram, or Chip Freliks, or Radomir Kovac, or Goran Jelic, I think what strikes him is the shock of recognition that he's been in a position whereby he has done bad things, and he's looking for a coherent and sensible explanation, well researched, because although I was poking fun at Philip Zimbardo, you can't challenge his method. The way in which he collects data and makes sense of it is perfect. She may well be a journalist, but I have to say, the way in which she marshals her arguments and presents them is clear and lucid. So I think he's looking for an account for his own behaviours. I think there's a moral failing in Bauman, and that moral failing is reflected in certainly that key theme, first launched in Modernity and the Holocaust, of why people do bad things. And just gone over time. So I'll stop now, and thank you all for listening. And if anyone's got any questions, please feel free.
Interesting talk. Have you ever thought of linking in with Paul Leman? Paul Leman, the literary critic who invents the death of the author, in inverted commas, who then we find out subsequently was the author of many anti-Semitic articles in wartime Europe. What I'm kind of saying here... I'm not familiar with
Okay,
but there are certain commonalities, and they're perhaps looser than what you're trying to achieve here in terms of the inner life of Zygmunt Bauman. But at the heart of it is a sense that here is a sort of a thinker who comes up with a theory of human behaviour that de-emphasises agency and emphasises to an incredible deterministic level structure.
Yes.
In the very influential literary theory equivalent of you have Paul Leman essentially talking about the absence of the author in the text.
Yeah.
So therefore texts don't have authors, so therefore the author of certain malignant texts aren't necessarily to blame for them. And that's a highly reductionist reduction of his case. But there are nevertheless, if you will, commonalities between the two.
There are.
And in terms of the structure-agency divide, and where basically how one seeks to account for things, perhaps. I mean, you know, at the heart of it, you're kind of saying in Bauman's recent work, there's a sort of a self-interrogation.
Yes.
And that's perhaps necessary because, if you will, it has become public that indeed he was involved, if you will, in the security forces back in the day. And this then is an inevitable question that almost anybody ever since has been asking. about his work, and therefore he would have to address it in some way, or his work would, would come under challenge in a bigger way, I think. So obviously, whether he does it for pragmatic reasons or whether he's doing it legitimately in the spirit of self-inquiry and self-knowledge, he's nevertheless basically having to come to some sort of terms with his own behaviour. But to me, the broad cartoon version of it is de-emphasise the role of one's own agency and prioritise, if you will, or foreground social structure. And what's very interesting about your presentation is that you're a sociologist, but you're bringing agency into it all the time.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when I was preparing the book, I came across what Rorty had said about Martin Heidegger. And Rorty is saying, well, okay, this person was a Nazi, but that doesn't detract from the quality of his argument. Well, for me, it does. I mean, I think the thing is that I don't believe in that idea of the death of the author. I think that people have agency. It's a prejudice that I have. I was very conscious of the fact, when you see the poster and, why do good people do bad things, that people are going to turn up and expect that I'm going to tell them about the answer to human free will and determinism. It's because I'm not. But all I can say is that when I was writing this book, I started to look at my own self and where my ideas came from. And I delved into my childhood about why I place such an emphasis as a sociologist on agency. And there were things like, for instance, when I was a child, I was about 7 years old, I was watching there was a television series on British television called The Prisoner. Okay. It starred Patrick McGowan. It was set in Portmeirion, which is in North Wales near Portmeirion. And every week it was the same. Okay, why did you resign from the Secret Service? I'm not telling you. I'm not a number, I'm a free man. He was number 6. And every week he asked the same question, who is number 1? And it went on for 18 weeks. And then in the 18th week, he comes face to face with number 1. Okay, and I was sat there, I was like a 7-year-old at the time, with my parents. And there's a person stood there with a big shroud on, big number 1. And Patrick McGowan, number 6, goes up to number 1, pulls the shroud off his head, and underneath there was a monkey's face. And I thought to myself, as a 7-year-old, oh, this is fantastic, because we're going to have a Scooby-Doo ending, pull it off. And I got away with it too, being for little darling kids, It's not going to be Mr. McGrew who runs the fun fair who's been keeping in prison for all these weeks. Anyway, we pulled off the mask, and underneath it was himself. And my dad said, what the bloody this is himself. And I turned to my dad and I said, Dad, I said, don't you realise what it is that he is his own jailer. That when you go through life, what happens is, you have all sorts of restrictions placed upon you, and you feel as if these restrictions are in some way external to you, situational forces. But in fact, these are constraints that you have placed upon yourself. Okay, you've placed upon yourself. And my dad looked at me and he said, that's very perceptive for a 7-year-old. In fact, an argument not wholly dissimilar from what Anthony Giddens will develop in his theory of structuration in a decade or so's time. Let me just wish I'd had that conversation with my dad. Of course, it didn't happen. I never had that conversation with my dad. Under any circumstances. I only said it to make me seem more interesting than I am, as if I got like friends and stuff, but I haven't. And most of the conversations I had with my dad were along the lines of, Dad, after football, can we get some Chinese? And he'd say, yeah, let's get them. No, Dad, take away. I think I don't agree with this idea of the death of the author. I think there is a self-interrogation that takes place. I've got a self-interrogation, but I still believe in individual responsibility, that people are responsible for the actions that they take, whatever circumstances they may be in. If I go back to the United Kingdom in a day or two's time, And I find out that the University of Manchester has been election rigging and involved in ethnic cleansing. I think I would rightly say, I don't want to work here anymore. I'll go down the road and work at Manchester Met. Bauman didn't do this. So I think there's a moral failing in him as a person, and this is reflected in his work, particularly with his notion of determinism, which I just cannot believe that people's lives are determined in this way. I can understand the Marxist stuff, where he's got economic determinism in that. I can fully appreciate that, okay? He has this postmodern turn. I have to say about Bauman, to his credit, he really is an intellectual entrepreneur, beyond excellence, okay? When he comes to Leeds in 1971, he looks at the world, dreadful world as it was then. It's all strikes and industrial unrest, state of emergency, and he develops this idea of socialism as an active utopia. So he hits the market at the right time. 1970s, we're all Marxists. Okay, Marxism falls out of fashion just at the time when 1989, when Modernity and the Holocaust is published. Okay, he becomes associated with postmodernism. Okay, becomes associated with postmodernism, although his commentators now point out, no, he wasn't a postmodernist. I mean, Tony Blackshaw, for instance, he wasn't a postmodernist, but he did draw upon Gilles Deleuze, Felix Guattari, and Jean-François Lyotard to good effect to develop his argument. He's not a postmodernist, he's a sociologist of postmodernity. Oh, there's a hair, let's split it. But you know, he writes this book, Modernity and the Holocaust, just at the time when Marxism has gone out of fashion, Berlin Wall is coming down, Soviet Union is collapsing, and so on. And it's clearly not just critical of socialism, it's not just critical of fascism, it's critical of modernity. So he becomes successful on a wave of postmodernism. And then, of course, when he realises, by the time he gets to 1997, and he realises that postmodernism is now falling out of fashion, he produces this book, Postmodernity and its Discontents, and then reinvents himself in the year 2000 under the brand Liquid Modernity. For me, they're the same ideas as his postmodern writings, but they've been rebranded and relaunched under a new name, which, for a critic of consumerism, I think is very clever. So he always hits the market at the right time, and been very successful as a consequence. Any
other questions or comments? Things you would like to throw in?
Thanks for a very engaging talk. I'm a bit conflicted, I have to say. I mean, first of all, I think it's a very rigorous critique of someone whose job really is critiquing. And I think one of the things you highlight, I mean, I don't know if I characterize it as entrepreneurship or good timing, or simply if you do write 50 books, it's quite likely that a few of them will appear at the right time, you know, but maybe 37 haven't. So on the one hand, there's a critique of the intellectual honesty of Bauman, right? And you suggest that he lied, basically until he was found out, and then grudgingly a morsel of truth kind of bubbles to the surface, which may well be true, and so I wouldn't dispute anything you say in that respect. I suppose my concern is, what does that tell us? Because on the one hand, it shines a light on a career and in some ways a publishing institution, and you have to wonder if this is, you know, if there is an essence to Bauman that's basically deceitful, that's complicit, that's characterized by convenience rather than principle. You know, flying your flag depending on the company you're keeping. I mean, obviously that then becomes a mirror, you know, what did people expect to find, you know, so it says something about the aura that perhaps has been constructed around them rather than the, you know, the petty details of an individual life. So it becomes a case of, you know, was it that people shied away from principled analysis and wanted kind of airport reading? And I suspect many of the commentators on Bauman would probably characterize it as, and I would say that your comment to the sociologist of postmodernity, I think it's actually quite right. I think he kind of writes about things. And I would have thought, you know, there to the Holocaust was a few examples where there really was sort of a real argument being developed rather than commentary. But I suppose my concern, sorry, it's a long rambling observation. My concern though is, what does that tell us about the broad question that's that you may or may not have been happy with the title of the talk, you know, why do good people do bad things? And I wonder if somehow we're caught between, on the one hand, these absolute categories, the idea that there are good people and there are bad things, and we will know them if we're honest. And I suppose it's really the structure agency in a way. In a sense, is Bauman's story the story of the world? Is Bauman different? I mean, it may be convenient or inconvenient for Bauman that the disclosures happen, but in a sense, does that not prove the point in a way? So I'm sorry. My puzzlement is, can you answer the question? And what do we now know about Bauman other than perhaps, you know, because one issue is full disclosure possible? Is there some pure essence that we will get there? And even if there is a pure essence, you know, how would we know, how would we articulate it, and so on?
Okay. Jolly good. Did a PhD Viva one day, and you know, you ask the candidate a question, and they say, that's a really good question, and you know what they mean to say is, you so-and-so. That first part of what you were saying, where in my head I thought, oh my God, the question he's asking me is, why did you decide to call Zygmunt Bauman a liar? Which is an interesting question. You know, at what point do you say, you are a liar? Right? Well, the second part of your question I can't answer because I don't know the essence of why good people do bad things. If I did, then I really would be looking forward to the book coming out, because then it really would have, in ref language, impact. Okay, I've made loads of money and I'd be like Philip Timbado and tell you whatever. But this question about why questions honesty in the first place goes back, and the reason why I don't want to answer this question is, what I'm going to come across it now as is somebody who is so unbelievably petty that you would never believe it was humanly possible. Okay? I mentioned to you that I had a fallout with Bauman in the late 1980s about Durkheim. Now, I have a fondness for Durkheim. Okay? I actually like it. Okay? I did A-level sociology as a 16 to 18-year-old, and of course, you know, week 1, slag off Parsons, week 2, slag off Durkheim on suicide. But when I went to university, I had a personal tutorial whereby a lecturer would sit there and there would be 2 students in front of him. One would be myself, and it was called Writing to Leaders. And what we had to do was we were given a task. So week 1, read the first chapter of the Rules of the Sociological Method. Come back next week, tell me what it's about, and tell me your observations. So we did. So I went off and I read the first chapter of the Rules of the Sociological Method, I came back and gave my observations. Well, I was shocked. was how sophisticated and clever a thinker Durkheim is. That I thought, when he talks about social facts as things, that he had some brainless idea of thing being like a table that was solid. Well, it is, of course, but there are 5 different conceptions of thing in that chapter. And although you can't justify what Durkheim is saying, but you can appreciate what he's trying to do, what he says is that when individual people make expectations of each other's behaviour in their everyday lives, when they're talking to people who make expectations of each other's behaviour, these expectations, they often echo a common sentiment, which he calls the collective representation. And these collective representations you can experience as being external to the individual and exercising a constraint upon a person. So, because agency has a role to play in that, this explains how and why the representations will change over time. So Durkheim talks about things like fashion changing over time, which is absolutely sound. So I'm sat in the seminar, and Bauman is talking about social facts thing, and he says, I can't even remember what the seminar was about, but I remember it. He says, social facts is a thing like a table, it's concrete. And I said, oh, excuse me, Professor, but I think you'll find that there's much greater role for agency there, actually creating the collective representations that then come to be experienced as external to the individual and exercising a constraint on them. Now, I'd had this conversation a couple of years earlier with a Marxist called Cliff Slaughter, and his response to me was, look, Shaun, I'll tell you for nothing. I read Durkheim 25 years ago, and I'm not reading it again to have an argument with you. So forget it. If that's your view, you keep it. Right? When I spoke to Bauman, it was very different. It was very different because, first of all, for somebody who was about to make his name as a postmodernist, he was extremely angry with a very rigid view that his view of Durkheim was correct and mine was wrong. Okay? So he was banging the table, pointing his pipe at me like this, getting across it and across it. At which point, because my human skills are not that good, that's why I've got no friends. That's the difference. It's another seminar. But I said to him, okay then, Professor, what's the first chapter of the Rules of the Sociological Method about then? And he fell silent. Now, it wasn't a rhetorical question. What I was looking for was, okay, you're an eminent professor and you've written like 30-odd books in your career so far, and I'm just a mere nobody. Maybe your interpretation of Durkheim is better than mine, because the thing about Durkheim, particularly the Rules of the Sociological Method, it's deceptively easy to read. You read it, and you think, oh, this is really good, this is really good, this is really, oh my God, I'm in love with Durkheim's work. I can't be, it's not fashionable, not trending. So I thought he had some interpretations that I didn't have. Anyway, many years passed, and I get the chance to write this book. It's great. Obviously, I'm going to say something about Durkheim, because in his liquid turn, Bauman makes a distinction between solid modernity and liquid modernity. When he's talking about solid modernity, he talks at some length about Durkheim on mechanical and organic solidarity. Right, fine, okay. So what I did was this. I was reading through it, and it's odd, when you get all the Bauman books, then think, I'm just going to go back to the beginning and have a look at what he said about Durkheim. Like that, which is right, because you wouldn't really read that. You wouldn't read books in that way. What I was surprised at was this. In Socialism, the Active Utopia, there's a quote from Durkheim, from Durkheim's book on socialism. Okay, this is Durkheim's definition of socialism. In Postmodern Ethics, 1995, there is a quote from the elementary forms of the religious life. In all the other writings, including all the liquid turn writings, every reference to Durkheim is drawn from one source, and the one source is Anthony Giddens, Emile Durkheim's selected writings, every single time. Now, I'm not criticising Giddens' book. I used it as an 18-year-old undergraduate, so it's excellent. But unlike Bauman, I didn't go launch a critique of solid modernity with Durkheim at the centre of it, with only Giddens to guide me. I think if you want to criticise Durkheim, go ahead and do it, but read it first. And what I came to the conclusion was then, having come across his interpretation of Durkheim, that if you look at the way in which he uses other texts, for example, Zimbabwe, he uses the bits of the argument that fit into what he wants to say, either about the argument he's developing or indeed about himself, and disregards all the things that contradict him, contradict what Bauman has got to say. So, what I'm suggesting is that those people who are impressed by Bauman's work, I think what they're impressed by is the slick gloss of the surface. He writes very well. You know, the use of simile, the use of metaphor, the poetic language, the construction of the sentences. You read it, you think, well, this is really nice. I think what his commentators do is they mistake that gloss for depth. And I think if you just scratch at the surface and say, look, what does he say about Durkheim? Why didn't he know that Parsons had written 15 papers about the Nazi Germany, including a paper about anti-Semitism? Okay, he didn't use the word Holocaust, but social system came out in 1951. The early Weasel, that didn't write till 1953, popularised the term Holocaust. So he doesn't seem to have read Durkheim. He doesn't seem to have known that Parsons was writing at some length, including the big book, The Social System, about Nazi Germany. What is this person doing? Well, this person is something of an intellectual fraud who's claiming to have knowledge which he just doesn't possess. People like me, who hasn't published a great deal, because I've been spending decades reading bloody Durkheim and Weber and Marx, and then oh, maybe I could write a textbook about this, in which I tell people what Durkheim, Weber and Marx said, and people look at it and go, is that the sum total of your life's work? Why can't you be like Zygmunt Bauman, the intellectual superstar? So as you can see, I've got a bit bitter, okay? I've got a chip on my shoulder, I've got fish and chips, in fact, piled up on my shoulders, like this. But in terms of that other question about why do people do bad things, I don't know. But what I do know is that Bauman doesn't have the answer either. And that's the best I can get to. Anybody else?
Can I just ask you one question? I mean, what do we do now, right? I mean, okay, he's been kind of found out, right? There is some reluctance I encountered in particularly in the BSA to discuss this in public in one way or another. You know, I personally, I have to say, people in my room a couple of years ago, I tried to do Bauman talk here as well, which was then still pretty much under the impression of the revelations. Now I've moved a little bit away from that and want to use it more as a case example of talking about collective memory. Stalinism works differently when we compare, let's say, to National Socialism, fascism, collective memory. What do we do now?
Right, to be serious for a minute. I think that there was a time when it was very, very difficult to get anything published about Bauman that was critical. So, I mean, and the number of rejections that I've had about papers that I've written about Bauman, I could wallpaper a huge room with it. I mean, interestingly enough, the talk that I've given you today, I did write a paper for Distinction, which is a journal that I have some respect for, I have to say. And I got two responses to that from the two anonymous reviewers, one of whom was very enthusiastic and said, my God, you're absolutely right, you should have known about Parsons. And yeah, most of the Holocaust was face-to-face, was cruel, wasn't at a distance, did have proximity. Brilliant. And the other person, what they said was, it was just inconceivable. I couldn't follow it. What's this person saying? And basically what they seemed to be saying was, you've made all these criticisms of Bauman and his work on the Holocaust and later genocides. but you don't have an answer to it. And I thought, oh, no, I don't have an answer to it. I'm just commenting on this famous book, which Bauman really launched his career as a public intellectual. So I think the tide is turning, because people in the BSA, you mentioned, I mean, I got a paper in August 2010 for sociology, which was about altruism, because I think that in liquid modernity, I don't think everything is fluid and flexible. I think there are people who are altruistic, and they're quite widespread in the population. Some of the examples they asked me to cut out, such as pigeon fanciers, because I thought it was just being silly. But other examples, like football fans, for instance. I've got a paper coming out in January in Soccer and Society, which is about those football researchers, Tom Bradshaw, who apply Bauman's ideas on consumption, and indeed Mapascoli's ideas on neo-tribes, to football fandom, saying that it's consumption. Now, it might just be because I'm of a particular age, but for me, if you're a football fan, what you have to do is you've got to go to every game, you've got to sit there in the crowd, you've got to get rained on, and you have to go with your team, win, lose, or draw. Okay? There are people, obviously I work at the University of Manchester, I come across a lot of people, particularly young men, who turn up and they say, I'm going to go watch United. I'm going to go watch United. Or when my team loses, I go, your team lost. And I'll say, could you just explain to me what connection you have with the city of Manchester, apart from having been here as an undergraduate for one semester? Okay. You have no concept of place. This team is nothing to do with you. But there are people who do regard football as being part of some sort of consumption experience, whereby you can buy a replica kit, you can subscribe to Sky Sports, and follow your team on a blog. Well, that's not fandom. It's consumption, but it's not fandom. I think the real fans, of which there are many, are very altruistic. In England, the third tier of English football is called League One. And I remember going to watch Hereford Town play. First time they'd been in League One, they got absolutely stuffed. And there was 60 fans there in their Hereford replica kits, chanting all the way through. And I thought, those people are not experiencing liquid modernity. Those people are altruistic. Okay? Now the paper, that's in Soccer and Society. The paper in Sociology was about suicide bombers, and it was an narrative analysis of the martyr videos of Mohammed Sadiq Khan and Shazam Tanzania. I didn't mention this in the book, but it does seem odd that the four of us, myself, Bauman, Mohammed Sadiq Khan, Shazam Tanzania, are all there, living in very close proximity in Leeds. We all belong to religious minorities. We've been Roman Catholic of Irish descent, Bauman being Jewish and Polish descent, and the other two Yorkshire lads who were Muslims. We all live in close proximity. We've all been to universities in Leeds, and yet our lives are very different as a consequence. But I did this narrative analysis, and what comes across really clearly in what they said in their martyr videos is altruism. That they were doing the acts that they did. They were planning to do those acts out of a sense of duty. That they had a sense of community and brotherhood across the world with other people in other parts of the world, Palestine, Chechnya, as well as Iraq and Afghanistan. And that what shocked me was, of course, that they spent a lot of time in the videos talking about Muslims in Britain and how disappointed they are that these people have chosen to give up Islam and instead to follow consumption, to drink alcohol, smoke cigarettes, watch EastEnders. But they say this. And actually that paper took a long time to get published. There was an earlier version which I sent to Education, Knowledge and Economy, because I know the editor. And he wrote back to me and said, well, we like this, because I had this idea. In Britain, the Thatcher government introduced a school census, and basically all it was that the government wanted to know from head teachers, how many kids have you got in your school? And you tell them. The Blair government, after 7/7, the Blair government changed the census, so they wanted to know how many children have you got in the school, what is the first language of their parents, what's the religion of the child, has this child been absent from school on an overseas visit? Now, it might be a leap of faith, but I think that because the 477 bombers had had no contact with the criminal justice system, okay? Jermaine Lindsay was arrested for shoplifting as a 12-year-old, but the rest of them, they didn't lead, to use a Bauman phrase, wasted lives. They weren't flawed consumers. In fact, when you see the inquest, at the inquest, you can still see this on YouTube. You can see the videos from Leeds City Station, from Luton, and from King's Cross, where the four of them are changing trades and making their journeys. And what strikes you is that these are literally our ordinary people. You would not recognise them as being any threat to anybody whatsoever. But anyway, so the Blair government changed the school census in order, I think, to try to identify potential suicide bombers or potential terrorists who do not come into contact with the criminal justice system. And Tony Kelly, who's a really nice person, he wrote to me and said, I'm sending the script back to you. So he sent me the script back, and I got the transcript. And handwritten, he'd gone through it and crossed out those bits that he didn't want in the article. And he said, we won't send it through the normal review process. We'll publish it if you agree to be published in this form. Okay? Now, because I'm desperate for ref returns, I said yes. Okay? But when I look at what he'd done, he'd taken out the voice of the terrorist. He'd just taken the voice out. He didn't. He got this odd paper talking about people's motives and intentions, but with no data to support the argument that's developed yet. You know. So yeah. But the point was that Bauman gets mentioned in there as well. So I think that there is a sea change taking place, because there does seem to be the opportunity now to read material that does engage with Bauman much more critically than in the past. And if I had to guess why, I think people are irritated by what you were saying. They're irritated by the pocketbooks that he's been producing. Okay, like the last one on education, it's got another one coming out in a few weeks' time, Liquid Surveillance. These are books of interviews where he's had email exchanges and puts his name on the cover, and the book comes out. Or the one I mentioned earlier, the 2012 book, This Is Not a Diary. You read it, and much of it is just drivel. It starts off saying, I looked out of the window, and the children are a different colour than they were when I moved into the house 30 years ago. Well, I don't care. Turn the page. So I think people are irritated by the idea that he seems to have reached this position now whereby he can publish anything about anything, and people will automatically consume it. It's worth exploring. I think many people are starting to look at particularly these short pocket books as being of little value.
Okay, no further questions, I think. Here. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you very much.
Entertaining talk.
I'm sorry, I'm still nervous otherwise.
Like a talk, we're having a quick drink in the common room. There's unfortunately no tap that the school can provide anymore. But if you want to discuss a little more, come along, please do so.